Welcome to today's webinar, Advocating for Poverty Reduction the Rights Way, Lessons from Canada Without Poverty and Together Against Poverty Society. My name is DJ Larkin. I'm a lawyer and advocate for the Pivot Legal Society, and it's my pleasure to introduce our webinar guest speakers, Michèle Biss and Stephen Portman. Michèle Biss is a legal education and outreach coordinator for Canada Without Poverty. Michèle began work at Canada Without Poverty in May of 2014. She holds an Honours Bachelor of Arts with specialization in religious studies, with a minor in English as well as a law degree from the Faculty of Law, both at the University of Ottawa. She has extensive professional experience working for marginalized groups through casework, research, and community legal education. Her particular areas of interest include support for women, persons with disabilities, recent immigrants, and persons living in poverty. She is a human rights lawyer and was called to the Ontario Bar in 2014. Stephen Portman is an advocacy lead with Together Against Poverty Society. Stephen has been working on the front lines of poverty-related social justice initiatives for the past 8 years in BC's capital city of Victoria. With the belief that equality is advanced through determined and pragmatic approaches that bring people together from a variety of backgrounds, he has applied his post-secondary studies in political science and history to grassroots advocacy. Stephen is the lead organizer behind the Employment Standards Legal Advocacy Project, a first of its kind in BC in the provision of targeted legal advocacy to low-income, non-unionized workers. A past chair of the Coalition for Public Legal Services, Stephen has long advocated for equal representation and sufficient funding in BC's justice system. And lastly, Stephen has provided systemic and individual advocacy in the areas of homelessness, welfare, disability, and tenancy on behalf of thousands of individuals living in poverty on southern Vancouver Island and across the province. Welcome, and thank you so much for being with us today. So before we get into the campaigns that we're going to be highlighting today, let's talk about poverty reduction work and how it applies to our human rights. So what is the context in which we say living free of poverty is a right that each of us hold? Michèle, would you like to address that?
Yes, absolutely. And thank you so much for the invitation to be here. I'm going to give this quick intro into international human rights and what it means for poverty work in Canada. I normally give this intro over 2 hours or sometimes 2 weeks in workshops, but I promised to keep it down to 5 minutes for this webinar. So my apologies that I can't go quite as in depth as I would otherwise, but if you have any questions, please hold them until the end when we discuss, and I can also reference a couple of publications to steer you towards for further reading. So fundamentally, a human rights approach recognizes that poverty is not a personal failure. It's not the inability of someone to pull up their bootstraps. Poverty has systemic causes. It is something that we are legally responsible to address. It takes us from this us and them mentality and instead empowers those who have been marginalized. So what kind of rights are we talking about when we're talking about human rights and poverty? We're talking about civil and political rights, like the right to life, but we're also talking about economic and social rights, an issue that not always gets discussed. Economic and social rights like the right to food, the right to housing, the right to health, and an adequate standard of living. These are a couple of examples, there are more. And where do these rights come from? I think that the historical context of human rights is really important to the conversation. The very first treaty or covenant that Canada signed was the Universal Declaration of Human Rights back in 1948. And the context here is right after the Second World War, where the world looked at itself and the atrocities that happened in the Second World War and decided what we wanted to become as a world. And thus became the Declaration of Human Rights, which Canada, of course, did ratify. And something quite interesting about this is that Article 12 of the Declaration does specify the right to an adequate standard of living. These economic and social rights that I just mentioned, the right to food, the right to housing, the right to health. After this, Canada has signed a number of other covenants that guarantee the right to an adequate standard of living, as well as these other rights. I won't get into all of these treaties and what they are, but one that I will point us to in particular is the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. We signed this back in 1976. We ratified this covenant, which spells out specifically these economic and social rights that we are responsible for. Article 11 of which is perhaps the most fundamental to economic and social rights in Canada. And I want to mention as well, I think this is so important to our discussion, that these obligations fall to all levels of government. So that means that these economic and social rights are the responsibility of provinces, territories, local governments, and the federal government. It's very important to remember that it does fall to all levels of government. The other question then is, how do we achieve these rights? Well, there's this idea of progressive realization. It means that we have to take small steps towards the realization of these rights. We have to keep moving forward one step at a time. But it doesn't mean that we have to take a giant leap overnight. It doesn't mean that we have to move from 4.9 million people in Canada who are living in poverty today to 0 tomorrow. It's progressive realization, but it means that we always, always have to keep our human rights obligations in mind, and we always need to be moving forward. So how is Canada held accountable for these rights? Some of you might not have even heard of economic and social rights, but have heard probably about civil and political rights, like the right to vote, the right to not be tortured, all of these fundamental rights. Where do these economic and social rights get upheld? Well, there's a couple of ways that the United Nations keeps us accountable for these rights. One of the ways is through treaty body reviews. So treaty bodies are responsible for reviewing Canada's compliance under each of these covenants. So, for example, the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights just met in February 2016 to review Canada's compliance with the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. And the individuals who sit on this committee are experts from a whole variety of countries, meaning that they don't really represent those countries, but they're experts that are identified because of their expertise in that area. At this last review of Canada back in February, Canada was, for example, asked about their ability to create a rights-based national anti-poverty plan. This was a big issue that came out. And in the concluding observations of that review, which is the final report that comes out of that review, Canada was told by the United Nations, as we've been told in many other years, that we must create a rights-based national anti-poverty plan in consultation with civil society, Indigenous groups, and others. At these reviews, often NGOs are present, and we go to Geneva and we sit there in the room as this review takes place, as this committee questions Canada on their compliance with each of these covenants, and we take the opportunity to ensure that all of the people sitting on the committee are informed about what's really going on in Canada. It's something that we'll get into a little bit, I think, a little bit later in this discussion. And interestingly, I'll flag that at this last review in February, DJ and I were both present. Something also to flag for us that's quite interesting is that there is another review of Canada under one of these treaty bodies that's coming up just around the corner. In October, there will be a meeting of the Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, at which time, again, these issues of poverty, the right to housing, the right to food, in particular under the lens of the feminization of poverty and the experiences of women experiencing poverty, single mothers, racialized women, other women who are very much marginalized will definitely come out in the committee. So that's an interesting thing to watch out for this October. The other piece I'm just going to touch upon before I wrap us through this, as I promised, very quick overview of international human rights. There are also United Nations special rapporteurs who review different thematic areas related to our international human rights. There are 42 thematic special rapporteurs. There's also country special rapporteurs, but I won't get into that. Of these 42 thematic special rapporteurs, they cover issues like extreme poverty, food insecurity, right to housing. And what these individual experts do, and there's only one for each thematic area, they write reports, 2 thematic reports every year on an issue related to their area. And they also do country visits where they assess that country's adherence to that particular topic. What's quite interesting is we have a couple of special rapporteurs who are from Canada. And in fact, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the right to housing is Canada Without Poverty's Executive Director, Leilani Farha. And if there is ever a systemic issue that you see in terms of housing, please feel free to reach out to Canada Without Poverty, as that is part of her mandate role, is to look into these issues addressing the right to housing. So with that, I will conclude my very, very brief overview of human rights.
Remarkable overview, and only in 5 minutes. Thank you, Michelle. I look forward to getting to a bit more of a discussion about maybe some of the different aspects between taking a rights-based approach as opposed to sort of a charitable model approach to poverty reduction. But first, let's talk about what does it look like in practice. So how does Canada Without Poverty and Together Against Poverty Society structure campaigns? So let's start again with you, Michelle. Could you share with us your work on Dignity for All and advocating for the right to a national poverty reduction strategy and freedom of food insecurity?
Absolutely. So I'll start with a note that the Dignity for All campaign is a campaign that's co-led by two organizations, Canada Without Poverty and our amazing partners over at a group called Citizens for Public Justice here in Ottawa. And back in 2009, the campaign Dignity for All came together to make sure that there was a national voice on poverty issues in Canada. And it came together with the goal to create a national poverty plan that is both legislated in an act and adequately funded. A big focus of the campaign especially was to ensure that people living in poverty had their voices heard by policymakers. So the groups that were involved in coming together with the campaign and supporting the campaign involved nonprofit groups, community groups, faith-based communities, governments, academics, people from all across the board, including people with lived experience of poverty. And the way that we conducted this plan, or that we conducted this campaign, was we worked towards creating a model national anti-poverty plan. And the way we did this was we held 6 policy summits on different topics. We held policy summits on labor and employment, early childhood education and care, housing, food insecurity, health, and income support. And at each of these 6 summits, we had different experts in those areas I mentioned earlier, but most fundamentally, people with lived experience were in attendance at those summits. And we sat around tables, and based on those topics, we argued and debated what would go into a national poverty plan. What did we want to see as civil society in a national poverty plan? At the conclusion of these summits, we put together a model national anti-poverty plan for Canada, which is the Dignity for All campaign. And so in past years, we organized the Chew on This campaign as a way to really publicly say, we need a plan to end poverty in Canada. We have this model national anti-poverty plan that many groups in civil society have created, and so how do we take that message to the streets? And the way that we did that is on October 17th, which is also the International Day for the Eradication of Poverty, starting in 2013, so this will be year 4 of the campaign, groups across Canada hand out paper bags with an apple, postcard, and other materials, and they engage passersby about the 1 in 8 households in Canada who struggle to put food on the table, and the lack of a national anti-poverty plan, a rights-based national anti-poverty plan, I should say, to address the issue. In past years, we've grown this to about 50 groups in almost all provinces and territories, hitting the streets, going up to people and saying, would you like an apple? Did you know that 1 in 8 households in Canada struggles with food on the table? Now we have this really interesting moment. As many of you might know, the federal government has promised to create a Canadian poverty reduction strategy. That's a huge moment, and we want to celebrate this with our campaign this year. But really fundamentally, we want to make sure that this is a rights-based Canadian poverty reduction strategy. So making sure that rights are explicitly referenced in a Canadian poverty reduction strategy, that the government is held accountable, that there are review mechanisms, that there are targets and timelines, that marginalized groups are considered, and very importantly, that people living in poverty are at the table in the creation, implementation, and monitoring of this poverty reduction strategy. So we're about to have a very big campaign this October 17th. We're currently gathering organizers. What you need to do to become an organizer is simply sign up, find volunteers, pick a location, and order materials from us, and find an apple or a local food product to put into your bags and take to the streets with us on October 17th. If you're interested, please feel free to send me an email. I'm sure that the information will be distributed, but just for the record, it's Michèle with one L, M-I-C-H-E-L-E at cwp-csp.ca if you'd like to organize a group in your community.
Fabulous. So I'd like to turn it now over to Stephen Portman. Stephen, in Victoria this year, Superintendent City was established on the lawn outside the BC Supreme Court House in Victoria, and it captured attention across Canada, shedding light on some much needed, shedding some much needed light on extremely poor conditions that homeless people are faced with every day. Can you speak to how TAPS became involved in the campaign, the work that you did around people's rights to adequate shelter?
Yeah, I just want to say at the outset that I'm coming to this discussion a little bit late. Living on Vancouver Island, the joke is that we live on island time, and it is actually, it's not a joke, it holds true. On Vancouver Island, we do not have a sense of time, especially Eastern Standard Time, so I apologize for coming to the call late. I would just want to say a quick thank you to Tamarack for organizing this, and and then I'll tell you a little bit about Tent City. Tent City in Victoria, it was, people often ask, like, how did we organize it? How did we structure it? How did TAPS become involved? Our entire participation in asserting on behalf of the residents of the Tent City in Victoria the right to shelter was entirely reactionary. Everything that we did was a response to what people living in homelessness were doing and what they needed. So our organization in assisting the homeless of this community started when we saw tents go up. We've been in town in Victoria doing anti-poverty work for about 27 years, so a lot of the people who were putting up tents were past clients of our office. And I think the relationships that we had built with those people who started erecting those tents was central to our success in being able to develop a lasting and trusting relationship with them to help them assert their rights. We came to this work a little bit off the side of our desks. So working through a rights-based lens on behalf of people who are homeless isn't something that TAPS has always done. What we do is very much service delivery. We don't do campaign work traditionally, things like Chew on This, like Michèle was discussing. We help people one at a time who may have legal disputes with landlords, trouble with the Ministry of Social Development that provides welfare benefits or disability. We help low-income, non-unionized workers in disputes with employers. And in doing all of that work, one consistent challenge we have always seen as an organization is that helping those people one at a time isn't doing anything structurally for those individuals who have no place to live. It's very hard to help anybody advance in their life one case at a time, one minor dispute at a time through a tribunal process. And we've been looking for ways that we could help do something that would help on a much larger level to confront homelessness. And the people who put those first tents up on the courthouse property in Victoria enabled us to have that opportunity to support them to achieve some of those larger systemic goals. So I think what we saw that was the impetus for us helping that as well was decades of disinvestment in social housing in this community. We're a small city, comparatively speaking, with a large homelessness problem, with about 1,400 people who are living without proper, adequate shelter. And the one thing that we hear in the nonprofit community across the Capital Regional District here is that there just are not enough units. There's not enough housing to do anything about this problem. And then we say, okay, well, how do we get more units? And the nonprofit sector service providers would say, well, we need more funding from the provincial government and the federal government. And it may be no secret to many people who are on this call that getting money for direct investment in social housing from the provincial and federal government in British Columbia has been a major challenge for every community, and Victoria was no different. And the traditional ways that we would go about trying to increase that investment in housing are direct asks to our housing ministry and federally to the Minister of Social Development. And it wasn't getting gains, and our problem was just getting worse. And frankly, we had no idea what to do about that. The dial wasn't moving. We've written all the letters we can. We've held all the rallies that we can. We've talked to media. We've talked to our neighbors. And we're just not getting new units of housing. When Tent City first came up, I felt very defeated about trying to get new units of housing. It wasn't really TAPS's goal in supporting the residents there necessarily at the outset to just get more units of housing. What we wanted to do is ensure that the rights of the homeless that were living there were respected, because so often tent cities are disbanded and displaced without the rights of the homeless being respected, and so that was our initial goal. Now, to make this very long story short, throughout our work in supporting the tent city residents, that's why I started off by saying it was reactionary, the goal shifts because the goal is set by the people who are living there themselves. But through the litigation that we supported, we were able to realize some pretty fundamental successes, and I'll just lay those out now. At the end of the day, when the last tent went down at Tent City, we have seen direct and indirect investment in actual housing units at 714 units, $86 million directly and indirectly attributable to the litigation and the actions of the residents of Tent City. And today, every single resident of that Tent City, and our last list, our last count was 127, are living inside if they wanted. There are some people who did not want to go inside, but every single one of those people are now housed. And we see that, looking at our total number of homeless population in Victoria, at least half of that 1,400, so around 700 people, will have the option of a home in the next year and a half because of the success of Tent City in highlighting just what it means to be homeless in this community. And I think I'll finish there.
Fabulous, Stephen. You're going to make me cry. And also, you've had some Tent City had some incredible legal wins in defending the right of the Tent City to continue to exist in the face of a court injunction until that housing was actually available, which is a really important step forward in not only defending the rights of people who are living outside, but also making the right to housing and the right to poverty reduction a real thing. My 2 cents, sorry.
I have one more note here, and I think it's an important one. So before the first injunction hearing that we held, the province of course moved to evict the campers, and that's what provincial governments and municipalities do when they're faced with a tent city. The first tool they have in their toolkit to get rid of that visible homelessness is to evict those people through an injunction order. Had the province been successful in getting that injunction order the first time, had we not been able to find pro bono counsel, had we not been able to be on the ground at Tent City every day, meeting with people, gathering affidavit evidence, supporting them, making sure they had food, supporting the internal governance of that Tent City, and had we lost that initial injunction hearing, I have no doubt that we would have seen nowhere near the level of investment that we have today, and the people would have been moved away without a home. So there's a motto around Tent City. It's not really referred to in necessarily the strategic rights-based sense or the kind of conversation we're having now, but it ain't pretty, it's Tent City. And I think the path or the example of a Tent City to get systemic social change, to get investment in housing, it's a really unfortunate and unpretty tactic to take to get that result. But I'm not sure that without the stand that those individuals took on that ground, that we would have had anywhere near this investment.
Thanks so much, Stephen. So for many callers on the line, poverty reduction work has been conducted through a number of different lenses at different times. Some most notably would be the charitable lens and the economic development lens. Do either of you have suggestions for our callers based on your experience of how leaders of poverty reduction strategies can move towards a more rights-based approach? Do you have suggestions for friends in municipal and provincial territorial governments at the helm of poverty reduction strategies who are working within older restrictive legislative frameworks and policies? So I'll turn it over to both of you. Maybe Michèle, do you want to comment first?
Sure, yeah. Just kind of off the top of this question, I should mention that fairly recently, Canada Without Poverty has actually published an international human rights guide to local poverty reduction strategies on our website, which is a step-by-step tool for local governments who want to understand how to take these high-level ideas about international human rights and put them into their poverty reduction strategies in a really simple, basic way. So I urge you to take a look at that, and I'm happy to share the link over the conversation if that's helpful. And just to kind of get into the meat of this question, I always find that I don't ever see a reason why a rights-based framework or a rights-based approach cannot work alongside an economic development lens. Because I think that, as our executive director often says, good policy is human rights policy, and vice versa. If you ensure that your laws and policies, that your poverty reduction strategies are based in international human rights, you'll see the effect, you'll see the positive outcomes seeping out into the economy and into other aspects of the society. So, for example, when people living in poverty have enough money to spend on adequate food, adequate housing, when they have enough income, you're going to see those individuals putting that money back into the economy, and you're going to see growth in the economy. For too long, we've had this idea that inequality is the way to further our economy, and I think that that's very much wrong. When we use a rights-based approach, we can see the effects in other ways, in other aspects. There's also the point as well that poverty costs us money. It costs money to perpetuate poverty. For example, since we've been talking in the British Columbia context, it's been estimated that doing nothing to address poverty in the province of British Columbia costs $8.1 to $9.2 billion every year. But to create a poverty reduction strategy in the province of British Columbia, and I should mention British Columbia is the only province without a poverty reduction strategy or any real vocalized intention to create a provincial strategy. To create a poverty reduction strategy would cost $3 to $4 billion. So you can see in an economic sense how creating rights-based strategies by adhering to these international human rights obligations, it can further our economic growth. But I think overall, what we need for a rights-based approach to really become pervasive in these strategies is just a real shift in the way that we perceive poverty. And what I've been struck by a lot in my work, and in particular in conversations with Canada Without Poverty's board of directors, which I should mention, all of which have lived experience of poverty. All of our board members, whether in childhood, as adults, have either currently or in the past lived in poverty. And what I've seen from conversations with board members is just how persistent the discrimination and stigma against people living in poverty is in this country. And it's just so wrong, this idea that poverty is a personal failure. And I think you could really see this in the superintendent case playing out, as Stephen touched upon, the discourse in some of the media around the tent city, calling, saying that it was an inconvenience for individuals to be housed there when they had nowhere else to go. Splitting into this us and them mentality, the stigma, discrimination that we put on poverty, I think we need to go beyond that. And I think sometimes it's such a cliche to say, but what it will require is a movement shift, and it starts with each one of us in talking about poverty from a rights-based framework and understanding that poverty is a violation of human rights fundamentally. And that we need to move towards thinking of this within all aspects of our work and considering people living in poverty, those experiencing homelessness, food insecurity, as rights holders. Stephen?
Yeah, I just totally agree with everything you've just said. and I guess when I think of this question and what you just talked about, the fundamental, and especially being in the context of British Columbia, where we don't have a poverty reduction strategy, where our provincial government has said there's no way we're going to get a poverty reduction strategy, and where we often feel like anyone who's working on anti-poverty initiatives is in a very antagonistic position anytime they bring up how we could work structurally at the provincial level to address these challenges. It sends you back to your community and what you can do locally, and that's why Together Against Poverty Society narrowed in our support of Tent City. How do we get to that shift? And I think that the Tent City example provides a case study in communications for how we can talk about what that shift looks like. We worked really hard to support the residents to get their story out, so that and you can go to www.superintent.ca to look at the messaging that came directly from the residents there. We had a Facebook page and a website very early on, so that when the media started picking up these stories, there could be no mistaking the narrative that created the need for a tent city in the first place. And this made it very difficult for traditional actors who confront homelessness in a negative light to do so. And I think it was harder for the province to make the case for the immediate displacement of this homeless community, because the citizens of Victoria knew very quickly that what we had on our hands was an economic refugee camp, a place where people who had no other alternative had come together to create the only solution that they could. And because we got that message out early, it was very difficult for them to get the social license to just displace this thing and continue to underfund housing in this community. And so Michèle's right when she says we need that fundamental shift, but how do we get there? And I suggest the way that we get there in our poverty reduction strategies, if you're a provincial actor or a municipal actor, is to include homeless people in the way that you're directing your messaging. Their stories are the compelling stories. They're the accurate stories. They're the truth. And if you use that in the way that you approach the work that you do, if you're in BC, you may not convince the provincial government of anything, but you might convince neighborhoods. And you might convince the people around you of what it's going to take to solve this. The social argument is very clear, and the moral argument is very clear. And as Michèle pointed out, the economic argument is pretty clear in a province like this one. So why have we done nothing? And I think the reason we've done nothing is because our neighborhoods and our communities don't actually understand what's going on. And if we include the homeless and those affected in the leadership of these solutions, we can make the shift that Michèle has mentioned is necessary to move forward.
Thank you. So I'm being aware of time. I think, unfortunately, we'll have to move on, even though I have so many more questions for you on that point. We know that in Canada, despite commitments made in international law, like what Michèle has mentioned, our judicial system does not view many social and economic rights, like the right to adequate income or adequate housing, as being legally enforceable. So Michèle, have you heard the Canadian government argue that it is not necessary for Canada to recognize these rights as being part of our Constitution? Can you explain their argument a bit and give us your thoughts on this?
Yes. Is my short answer. Yes, I have seen the Canadian government making this argument. And I want to get to what this is about fundamentally. And if economic and social rights are not legally enforceable, or I would say the other word to say this is just justiciable, if they're not legally enforceable, then there is no way for a person living in poverty to say something like, I've been living in poverty for 30 years with inadequate housing, living in unbelievable living conditions, with income support programs that are just woefully insufficient. In cities with 0% vacancy rates, I could go on and on and on, but not having a voice or not having a way to voice these concerns in a meaningful way. How are those rights being fulfilled if you can't voice them, if you can't exercise them in a meaningful way? And we saw this play out. I'll just kind of point first of all to a time that I saw this play out, and then I'm going to talk to a larger context of what happened recently at the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. We saw this play out recently in a case called the Tanu Jaja case, or the right to housing case, where a group of individuals and an institutional applicant, the Center for Equality, Rights and Accommodation, argued before the courts that by failing to adopt effective housing strategies and by creating and maintaining conditions that led to and sustained homelessness and inadequate housing, the government had, both Ontario and the federal government, had violated their Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms obligations, as well as their international human rights obligations. And what's shocking about this case is that before any of the evidence was heard, and it was 9,000 pages of evidence. I don't know how many lawyers or people who worked in the legal world are on the line here, but 9,000 pages of evidence were filed. Before any of that was even looked at, the federal and provincial government of Ontario filed a motion to say that they wanted to dismiss all of the litigation before it was being heard, that it wasn't even worth being heard in the courts. The idea being that this wasn't an issue for the courtroom, it was an issue for politicians. It was settled out of court. And shockingly, the government, or so not the government, the judge at the first level agreed with this motion by the government, and this was appealed to the Ontario Court of Appeal. Again, it was held that it shouldn't even be heard, although it was a decision in which two judges agreed and one judge provided a dissent opinion that was quite excellent, and then it was not granted leave to appeal to the Supreme Court. And what it means fundamentally is not that the government found that economic and social rights, the right to housing, is not in the Charter. That's not what this decision said. What the government's action said is that they will not even hear about the possibility that these rights could become justiciable, that they could be heard in the courts. And that's really quite terrifying, because if you don't have a way to exercise these rights, how do they exist? And we saw this exact question play out quite recently at the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights back in February, at which time the committee said to Canada, how are you making sure that these rights are being exercised? And they actually pointed to this Tanu Jaja case as an example. And the committee was very adamant with Canada that they must ensure that economic and social rights are justiciable. They were absolutely clear on this point, and they were quite astounded by the government's response that they did not find that these needed to be exercised. So here we see a real disconnect in what we know to be international human rights law, but the UN is directly telling Canada about the ability to legally access these rights and what is actually happening on the ground here.
So just being mindful of the time, we have a couple of minutes left. So Michèle, you've touched on the challenges that we have in making economic and social and cultural rights, especially the right to not live in poverty, justiciable in Canada. So Stephen, I'm wondering if you can comment briefly on what that challenge is like on a day-to-day basis, doing the work that you do, working through either individual complaint systems or sometimes having no system at all to advance people's rights. And what are your thoughts moving forward?
I won't take up much time with this because it's just a dark response. I mean, I think it's pretty pathetic that that we can't move that dial, that we have been unable to move that dial federally to see this rights-based approach taken seriously by the federal government. And what that means on the street is it's a lot more difficult to support people to get what it is that they need, which is shelter. And so, what it means in the day-to-day life of many Canadian citizens who are economically disadvantaged is that their lives are on hold, and until we have significant movement in that direction, it's going to continue to be one fight at a time, one community at a time, one province at a time, to try and get people the basic necessities that they require to live their lives, and that's unfortunate.
DJ, if you don't mind if I throw in a one-sentence point here, being mindful of time, just to kind of add a little, I don't know, glowing ember or something for us to hold on to here for a little bit of hope. I will say that this is an issue, this full justiciability issue, is something that is on the mind of a lot of advocates, a lot of lawyers, a lot of people working in the legal world. And I think that we're going to see some really interesting things play out, certainly in the next 5 to 10 years, about this question. Because, I mean, if the UN has told us directly that we have to make sure that these rights are accessible, there's got to be some movement. And I know that there are a number of cases, I think, that will soon hit the courts, and this is going to become more and more of an issue. So I think that there is some hope for change, hopefully, around the courts.
Thank you both. It sounds like, and what I can hear is, if anyone is looking at advancing policy, legislation, regulations, the number one thing they could do right now to help would be to acknowledge that people are rights holders so that they actually have a place to go and have a voice in the process. So I will move on to our questions and comments period so that we don't run out of time. We have actually about 7 minutes because we got started a little bit late, and I'll encourage you to submit your questions through the chat box in the GoTo control panel. We have some questions that were submitted prior to the webinar, so we'll start with those and then move on to questions that you're typing in through the questions box. So let's start off with what are the biggest takeaways from the case studies of what helped or hindered progress towards systems change poverty reduction? So the biggest help and the biggest hindrances that you've seen in these case studies. Not sure who'd like to go first there.
I'll take it. I think the question's a little bit awkward, but one of the takeaways that from my perspective and from the perspective of Together Against Poverty Society is that if we're going to continue ensuring that the rights of people who don't have a place to live are respected moving forward, it would be so much more effective if we weren't reacting, if we were in a position where we could be more proactive, right? The fact that in order to support the residents of Tent City, it was a side of the desk project for a very small grassroots organization. It took almost everything we had to support them, and it was incredibly challenging for us organizationally and for everyone in our support networks to do this work. Was it worth it? Absolutely. But when we look at what's going to happen the next time there's a Tent City, I think organizations need to look at how they can support people who are homeless and people in street communities ahead of time and start planning on what it's going to take to support the next group of people who need to stand up to assert their rights to exist somewhere when they have nowhere else to go. And if we're going to move the dial in British Columbia, I think it's incredibly important that we start looking now at how strategically we can support these communities to lead their own struggles. And that's the number one takeaway for me is that the next time this happens, and there will be a next time, we can't always be reacting and making this a side of the desk project. If we really want to move something systemically, we have to start being more strategic.
That's so true. Ditto to what Stephen said. But also to kind of add something in from a national perspective, I think one of the biggest challenges that we face is that Canada is enormous and our communities are so incredibly diverse. And I find often when I'm traveling to local communities, there's an interest in involving yourself in local poverty issues, local initiatives. There's an interest in working on territorial perhaps, but there's such a disconnect between what is happening here in Ottawa federally and what's happening in local communities. And I think because of that disconnect, we're a little bit disjointed in the way that we can see change happen on this federal scale. So I think one of my biggest takeaways is how important that communication aspect is. And I think in my eyes, that's one of the great things about the Chew On This campaign is it's a way to take the local and bring it up to national and kind of join our voices all together. Because I think that the movements that connect us are such powerful tools, and especially with this federal government, I think that's the way that we're going to see the most change.
Thank you. I'm going to move on. We have had a couple of questions come in, but we have one more from the pre-questions. Canada endorsed the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights and the International Convention on Human Rights as a nation. Can you speak to how provincial territorial control over social matters, and this is a constitutional division of powers question, may be undermining Canada's full compliance with those international instruments. And maybe, Michèle, I'll ask you to comment on that briefly.
For sure, that's a really good question, one I often get asked. And something I'm going to point us to in particular is the fact that these human rights obligations we're talking about really truly do fall on all levels of government. Whether or not all levels of government are aware of that, they most certainly do. So for example, when Saskatchewan cuts disability benefits, which are already dismally low, when they backtrack on that, that's retrogressive, that's a violation of international human rights. So it falls on all these levels of government. So that's my first answer. My second point I want to make is even though this obligation falls on all levels of government, and even though some areas are so particularly within the provincial and territorial jurisdiction, that does not take the federal government off the hook. There are certain areas that the federal government is responsible for, which they need to step up on. So, for example, they control the Canada Social Transfer. They're in charge of issues for Indigenous persons. They're in charge of immigrant issues. The list kind of goes on and on. So there is a way, we're talking about a big movement change to see all of these levels of government to step up and realize that they have international human rights obligations and to start thinking creatively about how they're going to apply a rights-based framework, of rights-based understanding to each of those policy decisions affecting people living in poverty.
Thanks, Michèle. So one of the questions coming in, and Stephen, maybe I'll direct this to you. It seems like creating realizable or justiciable rights requires a significant institutional investment and buy-in. What can we do for ourselves and for our communities using a rights-based approach that doesn't require such a transformation in our, just to name a few examples, justice, housing, and law enforcement institutions? Stephen, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I think I maybe even answered that question through our discussion already. Like if we're not touching the institutional change that is necessary, then it's about communicating at the community level why it is important to address these issues and addressing the stigma that exists around poverty issues in general.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Again, my 2 cents. I think one of the things in community that everyone can do is to help fight the stigma against things like poverty reduction, housing for people who are homeless, healthcare that's necessary for people. When you see misunderstandings in the community, be a part of that education going forward that helps decrease the stigma that people experience, right? So we have one last question and just enough time for it. And it is, do you think that more groups pressuring the judicial system to take on rights-based cases would be useful to push the tide and perhaps find a judge who will not take the government side? If not, what do you see as the most actionable way to push this envelope? Let's start with Michèle and we'll end with Stephen.
Oh man, that's a good question. Okay, so off the top of my head, because that's a really good question, I think that it would have to come from a very large way. I think that there certainly is something to be said for using the courts to push these means. And I think there's something to be said for also pushing the political to see the need for a rights-based approach. I think that we need to look at it from a very comprehensive perspective, right? It needs to come from all sides. There's already some really excellent groups working on some litigation where these issues could best come up. There's potentially going to be some different actions on panhandling bylaws on some of these tent cities going on a number of other issues that are taking place where this issue of justiciability of rights is going to come up. I can tell you it's going to come up in the courts. And I think it's about informing, everybody about this responsibility, about what a human rights approach is, and how very much it applies to poverty in Canada, and how we really need to live up to our obligations. So I hope that answers your question, but that's a really good question.
Yeah, I think the answer to your question is yes. We need to litigate where it makes sense. I think that our provincial and federal governments are complicit in reducing an increasing number of Canadian citizens into a place of economic insecurity where they're struggling to survive. And that will require, and to turn the tide on that, as Michèle said, we need a comprehensive approach where people are working in many different areas, in many different ways, and building bridges. But where it makes sense, we need more litigation. We need to go to the courts more often, and we need to go to the courts more proactively. We don't need to wait for a special judge. We need to make the case when it makes sense. And when we make those cases, we need to be very public and about how these cases come to be, and why it's important that we're turning to the courts. And I think I started by saying I'm deeply disappointed that we've come to a place where we need to take governments to court to provide a roof over a human's head. I think it's really disappointing and upsetting to me that we're in this place, but clearly the case study of Tent City presents where we had no other option to get those roofs over those heads. Litigation was the only thing that got us there. So yes, we need that, and as Michèle said, we need a much more comprehensive approach on many different paths at the same time.
Thank you both so much. So this brings us to the end of our question period. Thank you to Stephen and Michèle for being part of today's broadcast and for sharing your collaborative wisdom with us. Thank you to everyone who has attended today and for your thoughtful questions. Hopefully we managed to answer them all. For more information about poverty reduction, you're invited to subscribe to Vibrant Communities' monthly newsletter, Cities Connect, and to join the Vibrant Communities online learning community for poverty reduction practitioners at www.vibrantcanada.ca. So if you enjoyed today's webinar, you may also be interested in the Community Change Institute that will dig into the art of disruption. It's a transformational experience being hosted by Tamarack Institute in Toronto, Ontario from September 26th to 30th. The 5-day learning experience will bring you the latest thinking in collective impact, collaborative leadership, community innovation, community engagement, and evaluating community impact. Tamarack will host a great lineup of world-renowned keynote speakers, so please visit events.tamarackcommunity.ca/CCI_Toronto to learn more, or be in touch with Stephanie at tamarackcommunity.ca for information on the group experience. And in a few days, you will receive an email with a link to an audio recording of today's call. And you may also email Natasha at tamarackcommunity.ca to provide feedback about today's seminar. Thank you again so much for joining us. Thank you to our panelists, and I wish you all a great day.